Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I am your host, Brian Scott, and today I can't wait to dive into some more of the Seth material. Check out my previous episodes where I talk about Seth, who is a channeled being written about by Jane Roberts. Jane Roberts was a fantastic writer who talked about clairvoyance and ESP, and her discussions of Seth and the books that are written about Seth, who is a being very much like Abraham or Bashar, that Jane Roberts would channel. And there have been many great books written through the Seth channelings. And I have dedicated 2 episodes, so check those out. There is the God concept that's described by Seth, which is very interesting, and then an explanation on how to use the inner senses, what they are and how to use them, which I found to be very important and interesting teachings. There's a chapter I have in my recent book, The Reality Revolution, The Mind-Blowing Movement to Hack Your Reality, called The Health Revolution, and it's a discussion of reality creation and the way it affects your body and your health, and how we can overcome most major problems through our minds and the way that we create reality. And this is reflected in this teaching that I have, where Seth discusses health and reality creation and the way that you affect your health by the way you think. And his teachings are fantastic, and after reading this several years ago, they come to mind all the time. And a lot of this you probably already know, but Seth has a certain way of teaching it and understanding the way that your attitude and habits and behavior, and the way that even your imagination can affect your health, and trying to get that inner sense of your body as a part of it. So I wanted to share this because at the time that we're writing this, we have the coronavirus, and people are worried about their health. And this fear that you see from the deluge of media information constantly talking about unhealthy situations is a little bit scary for me, because people have vivid imaginations and they start to imagine these things in their own bodies. So I think it's very important, if we understand that we create our reality, and every single cell that we have in our body is created from food that we've eaten, and that food we have projected our thoughts into. There's so many things that are important to understand. It's not about what's happening out there. It's what kind of health you're in here. So, Health by Jane Roberts, channelings from Seth in the Seth Material, Chapter 13. How can you stay healthy? How can you get rid of any illnesses you might have? Exactly what is the connection between your state of mind and your health? Seth's ideas on this subject have been of great value to Rob and me, and to everyone who has come in contact with them. We have put his concepts to work in our own lives, and sometimes both of us wonder how we managed daily life before we understood the close relationship between thoughts, emotions, and health. A few weeks ago, we heard that a former neighbor had just died. Joni had lived in our apartment house for a year or so. Once, right across the hall from us, she was thin, red-haired, with a wild temper. I think she was one of the wittiest people I've known, and she was a great mimic. But she often used her wit like a sword. It was cruel humor, even when she turned it against herself, as she often did. She was in her early 30s with a good job, but she looked down on all the other employees. Her marriage had ended in divorce before she moved here. And while she always talking about getting married again, she had a great distrust of men. I think she really hated them. She didn't think much better of women, yet at times she could be very warm-hearted. She took a liking to Rob and myself, and we often would sit, she and I, at the same table where I'm writing this book, and chat. She always began with, one of her fantastically funny, sarcastic tales about someone she knew. She had an uncanny ability to sense people's weak points and make fun of them. For all of that, when she was not sick, she had a fine vitality and a keen native shrewdness. We played a sort of game. I liked her, but I wasn't going to be besieged by a barrage of negative thoughts and pessimism for an hour, no matter how wittily presented, and she knew it. The worst part was that she really was funny, and it was hard as the devil not to laugh at her, even when I knew I shouldn't. And she knew this too, so she would try to see how far she could go before I would call her on it and begin a mini lecture pointing out that her attitude toward other people was largely responsible for her difficulties. And her difficulties were illnesses of such variety and vigor that I think it was impossible, even for her, to recount what had afflicted her in any one year. Some were serious, and she had several operations. She picked up every infection in vogue, and many that weren't. She went from doctor to doctor, and always with quite definite and often appalling physical symptoms. Her diet was greatly restricted, and her illnesses began to become more and more severe. Emotionally, she went from exaggerated heights to exaggerated lows. Her age bothered her. She was certain that life would be over by the time you reach 40. And for her, it was. By several years. Yet we were all astonished to hear of her death, even though we realized that she was literally making herself sick. We had no idea that she was sick to death. Remember what I said earlier, that we form physical reality as a replica of our inner ideas. This is a major premise of the Seth material. Joan literally disliked everyone with few exceptions. She was convinced, furthermore, that she was unliked and unlikable. She felt persecuted, sure that people were talking or gossiping about her when her back was turned, because this was precisely what she did. Daily life contained all kinds of threats for her, and she kept her nervous system in a constant state of stress. Her body defenses were lowered. She was tired of the constant battle, never realizing that much of the war was one-sided and unwarranted. She projected her ideas of reality outward, and they literally led to her destruction. That she had been warned. 2 years before her death, she asked to attend a regular Seth session. Seth was quite serious and not as jovial as usual, and at the time I thought that he was being rather hard on her. Now I see that he was trying to impress her with the necessity of changing her attitudes and reactions. He stated his ideas on health as clearly and directly as possible, dealing with their practical application. I can almost see Joan sitting there, legs crossed, before the session. She had been able to follow his advice. I am convinced she would be alive and well today. I am also sure that the readers who understand and follow Seth's ideas on health will find their own greatly improved. You must watch the pictures that you paint with your imagination, he said. For you allow your imagination too full a rein. If you read our early material, you will see that your environment and the conditions of your life at any given time are the direct result of your own inner expectations. You form physical materializations of these realities within your own mind. If you imagine dire circumstances, ill health, or desperate loneliness, these will be automatically materialized. For these thoughts themselves bring about the conditions that will give them reality in physical terms. If you would have good health, then you must imagine this as vividly as in fear you imagine the opposite. You create your own difficulties. This is true for each individual. The inner psychological state is projected outward, gaining physical reality. And this regardless of the nature of the psychological state. The rules apply to everyone. You can use them for your own benefit and change your own conditions once you realize what they are. You cannot escape your own attitudes, for they will form the nature of what you see. Quite literally, you see what you want to see. And you see your own thoughts and emotional attitudes materialized in physical form. If changes are to occur, they must be mental and psychic changes. These will be reflected in your environment. Negative, distrustful, fearful, or degrading attitudes toward anyone work against the self. Joan sat tapping her foot nervously. There were no wisecracks. At the time, she was dating a man who drank too much. His drinking makes me irritable and angry, she said. He's my problem. He's the one who makes me feel nervous. Rob laughed. She sounded so put upon, so determined to place the blame elsewhere. You must understand something else, Seth said. Telepathy operates constantly. If you continually expect an individual to behave in a particular manner, then you are constantly sending him telepathic suggestions that he will do so. Each individual reacts to suggestion according to the specific conditions existing at the time. Such an individual will, to some extent or another, act according to the mass suggestions he receives. These mass suggestions include not only those given to him by others, both verbally and telepathically, but also those he has given to himself, both in the waking and dream states. If an individual is in a state of despondency, this is because he has already become prey to negative suggestions of his own and others. Now, if you see him and think that he looks miserable, Seth looked at Joan sharply, or that he is an incurable drunk, then these suggestions are picked up by him subconsciously. Though you have not spoken a word, and in his already weakened condition, they will be accepted and acted upon. If, on the other hand, under the same circumstances, you stop yourself and say gently to yourself, he will begin to feel better now, or his drinking is temporary, and there is indeed hope here, then you have given him aid, for the suggestions will at least represent small telepathic ammunition to help fight off the war of despondency. There are obviously ways in which you mold your own conditions. Protect yourself from your own negative suggestions and those of others. You must learn to erase a negative thought or picture by replacing it with its opposite. If you think, I have a headache, and if you do not replace this suggestion by a positive one, then you are automatically suggesting that the body set up those conditions that will result in the continuation of the malady. I will give you a commercial that is better than your Excedrin, you see, the short headache. I will tell you how to have none at all. This was the only touch of humor in the whole session. In a session devoted to a particular person, Seth usually goes out of his way to make a few jovial comments to set the person at his or her ease. We had a short break, and Joan continued to complain of her friend's drinking habits, how they only added to her own nervousness. She was certain that if she didn't have this to contend with, her health would return. Quite vehemently, she said about blaming her friend for almost all of her problems. When Seth resumed, he was even more serious than before. "Now, you are not speaking of basic issues," he said. "You are flying paper dragons to be punctured. But these are not the real dragons. You must learn to listen to the voice of the inner self. It is hardly to be feared. You have allowed the ego to become a counterfeit self, and you take its word because you will not hear the muffled voice that is within it. You have been examining others rather than yourself. What you see in others is the materialization, the projection of what you think you are, not necessarily, however, of what you are. For example, if you see others seem deceitful to you, it is because you deceive yourself and then project this outward upon others. These are examples now. If an individual sees only evil and desolation in the physical world, it is because he is obsessed with evil and desolation and projects them outward and closes his eyes to all else. If you want to know what you think of yourself, then ask yourself what you think of others, and you will find your answer. Another example, a very industrious individual thinks the majority of men are lazy and good for nothing. No one would ever think of calling him lazy or good for nothing, yet this may be precisely his own subconscious picture of himself, against which he drives himself constantly. And all of this without his realizing his basic concept of himself, and without recognizing that he projects his feared weaknesses outward onto others. True self-knowledge is indispensable for health or vitality. The recognition of the truth about the self simply means that you must first discover what you think about yourself subconsciously. If it is a good image, build upon it. If it is a poor one, recognize it as only the opinion you have held of yourself and not as an absolute state. With all her other troubles, Joan was frequently bothered by severe headaches. Before closing, Seth gave her advice, which can be used by anyone. You should tell yourself frequently, "I will only react to constructive suggestions." For this gives you some protection against your own negative thoughts and those of others. A negative thought, if not erased, will almost certainly result in a negative condition, a momentary despondency, a headache, according to the intensity of the thought. Now, if you find yourself with a headache, say immediately, "That is in the past. Now, in this new moment, this new present, I am already beginning to feel better." Then immediately turn your attention away from the physical condition. Concentrate upon something pleasant or begin another task. In this way, you are no longer suggesting that the body reproduce the headache conditions. The exercise may be repeated. It does not do to repress negative thoughts, such as fears, angers, or resentments. In other sessions, Seth makes it clear that these should be recognized and faced and then replaced. Repression has been one of my own habits, particularly after I learned how destructive thoughts can be. At first I went overboard, or tried to. I'd catch myself thinking a resentful thought about a particular person or situation, and I'd almost recoil. "Wow, that's a terrible thing to think," I'd say to myself. If I direct an aggressive thought outward to someone, then it can hurt them, I said to Rob. If I bury it, it can hurt me and emerge as physical symptoms of some kind. So will you please ask Seth in our next session what he suggests? In this one session, Seth explained the difference between repression and the correct approach. Rupert should remember to recognize resentment when he feels it, and then to realize that resentment can be dismissed. The initial recognition must be made, however. Then have him imagine plucking out the resentment by the roots and replacing it with a positive feeling. But he must imagine the plucking out process. This is the difference between repression and positive action. In repression, the resentment is shoved beneath and ignored. With our own method, it is recognized and imaginatively plucked out as being undesirable and replaced by the thought of peace and constructive energy. Seth has frequently cautioned me against repressing aggressions out of fear of them. Rob says that it is quite funny to him when Seth, speaking through me, takes me to task in this way. His suggestions have always been excellent, however. Later, he made a very good point. If desire for health leads instead to an emphasis upon symptoms to be overcome, you would be better off to avoid all thoughts of health or illness and concentrate in other directions, such as work. Such an emphasis can lead to a focus upon obstacles that stand in the way, and this reinforces the negative condition. Seth always says that life is abundant, vigorous, and strong. Each of us has our own defenses against negative suggestions, and we should trust in our own immunity. People react to negative suggestions only when their own frame of mind is negative. Then we close ourselves off from the constructive energies we need. Again, Seth is not suggesting we repress emotion. Spontaneity above all is the rule. If we were truly spontaneous, Seth says, we wouldn't need to worry about positive suggestions because our health would be normally maintained. One of my students, a businessman, always gets worried when Seth speaks about spontaneity. He equates it with lack of discipline. Seth calls this man the Dean with affectionate humor because he's one of my best students, and the others listen to his psychic adventures with a good deal of interest. But he's very much a community man also, and the word spontaneity can be like a red scarf to a bull, at least as far as he is concerned. And I have to admit that many of us have the feeling that our inner emotions are too hot to handle. We were talking about this in class one night when suddenly Seth came through. Emotions flow through you like storm clouds or blue skies, and you should be open to them and react to them, Seth said. You are not your emotions. They flow through you. You feel them, and then they disappear. When you attempt to hold them back, you build them up like mountains. I have told our dean that spontaneity knows its own discipline. Your nervous system knows how to react. It reacts spontaneously when you allow it to. It is only when you try to deny your emotions that they become dangerous. We had a new student that evening, and someone made the remark that Seth could be quite stern. Now he said jokingly, I have been drastically maligned this evening, and so I come to show our new friend here that I am a jolly fellow. That, at least, was my initial intention. Now it has changed, for I must tell you again that the inner self, acting spontaneously, automatically shows the discipline that you do not as yet understand. Now Seth, through my eyes, stared around the room. Someone picked my glasses up and put them on the coffee table. As I mentioned before, when Seth comes through, he always takes my glasses off and often flings them rather grandly upon the rug. The lights were on, as always. He faced the group and said emphatically, You are not your body. You are not your emotions. You have emotions. You have thoughts, as you have eggs for breakfast. But you are not the eggs, and you are not your emotions. You are as independent of your thoughts and emotions as you are of the bacon and eggs. You use the bacon and eggs in your physical composition, and you use your thoughts and emotions in your mental composition. Surely you do not identify with a piece of bacon. Then do not identify with your thoughts and emotions. When you set up barriers and doors, when you enclose emotions within you, as if you stored up tons of bacon in your refrigerator and then wondered why there was room for nothing else. He said to the dean, "Why is it so difficult for you to learn what freedom is?" Freedom, in the total sense, seems like irresponsibility almost. That is indeed your interpretation, Seth said, and this is because you set demands. Now I ask you, how far do you think a flower would get if in the morning it turned its face toward the sky and said, "I demand the sun, and now I need rain, so I demand it, and I demand bees to come and take my pollen. I demand, therefore, that the sun shall shine for a certain number of hours, and that the rain shall pour for a certain number of hours, and that the bees come, bees A, B, C, D, and E, for I shall accept no other bees to come. I demand that discipline operate, and that the soil shall follow my command, but I do not allow the soil any spontaneity of its own. And I do not allow the sun any spontaneity of its own, and I do not agree that the sun knows what it is doing. I demand that all these things follow my ideas of discipline. And who, I ask you, would listen? For in the miraculous spontaneity of the sun, there is discipline that utterly escapes you, and a knowledge beyond any that we know. And in the spontaneous playing of the bees from flower to flower, there is a discipline beyond any that you know, and laws that follow their own knowledge, and joy that is beyond command. For true discipline, you see, is found only in spontaneity. Spontaneity knows its own order. Again, Seth stared at the dean, but now he spoke to the others in the group. In the spontaneous working of your nervous system, what do we find? We see here the head of the dean that rests upon his shoulders, and the intellect that demands discipline. And yet all of this rests upon the spontaneous workings of the inner self and the nervous system, of which the intellect knows little. And without that spontaneous discipline, there would be no ego to sit upon the shoulders and demand discipline. Now that I have proven how jovial I am, you may all take a break. Everyone laughed. After our rest period, Seth resumed to answer some other questions, but he ended the last discussion with a smile for the dean. Now, the seasons come each year, as they have come for centuries upon your planet, and they come with a magnificent spontaneity and with a creativity that bursts upon the world. And yet they come within a highly ritualized and disciplined manner. For spring does not come in December, and there is a merging of spontaneity and discipline truly marvelous to behold. And you do not fear the coming of the seasons. Each of you in your own way contribute, for you can consider the body of the earth, and all that you know, the trees, the seasons, and the skies to some extent as your own contribution. The combination of spontaneity and discipline that gives fruit to the earth. All of nature operates spontaneously. Our bodies will be healthy automatically if we do not project false ideas upon them. But, of course, it is not as simple as all this. In speaking directly to people in class sessions, Seth tries to explain matters as clearly as possible and in a way that they can understand. In our own sessions, he goes much more deeply into such subjects. In the following excerpts for a private session, he explains the biological and psychic elements of pain and consciousness, and also states that illness itself is sometimes a purposeful activity. As you listen to this, think back to various illnesses you've had and see how this applies. Here Seth discusses illnesses in its relationship not only to the surface personality but to our deepest biological frameworks. Seth had previously spoken about Sally's, John's wife, need to dissociate herself from her sick identity. Now he elaborated. All illness is momentarily accepted by the personality as a part of the self. And here lies its danger. It is not just symbolically accepted, and I am not speaking in symbolic terms. An impeding action such as an illness is quite literally accepted by the personality structure, and once this occurs, a conflict develops. The self does not want to give up a portion of itself, even while that portion may be painful or disadvantageous. There are many reasons behind this. For one thing, while pain is unpleasant, it is also a method of familiarizing the self against the edges of quickened consciousness. Any heightened sensation, pleasant or not, has a stimulating effect upon consciousness to some degree. Even when the stimulus may be humiliatingly unpleasant, certain portions of the psychological structure accept it indiscriminately because it is a sensation and a vivid one. Now Seth comes to this very point, very important in his theories. This acquiescence to even painful stimuli is a basic part of the nature of consciousness. Action does not differentiate between pleasant, painful, or joyful stimuli. These distinctions come much later and on another level. Here Seth is considering personality as composed of energy or action. Action accepts all stimuli in an affirmative manner. It is only when it becomes compartmented, so to speak, in the highly differentiated consciousness that such refinements occur. I am not saying that unpleasant stimuli will not be felt as unpleasant and reacted against in less self-conscious organisms. I am saying that they will rejoice even in their automatic reaction, because any stimuli and reaction represent sensation, and sensation is a method by which consciousness knows itself. The complicated human personality, with its physical structure, has evolved along with some other structures, a highly differentiated I consciousness, the ego, in other words, whose very nature is such that it attempts to preserve the parent boundaries of identity. To do so, it chooses between actions, but beneath this sophisticated gestalt are the simpler foundations of its being, and indeed the very acceptance of all stimuli, without which identity would be impossible. Without this acquiescence to even painful stimuli, the structure would never maintain itself, for the atoms and molecules within it constantly accept such stimuli and joyfully suffer even their own destruction. Being aware of their identity within all action and not having the complicated I structure, there is no reason for them to fear destruction. They are aware of themselves as a part of action. Now, all of this is basic knowledge if you would understand why this personality accepts even impending action such as illness, despite the ego's resistance to pain. Seth goes on to say that illness can be a healthy reaction, though it always involves personality problems. It must be understood by the personality that the illness is a hardship on the part of the whole structure and not basic to the original personality. The whole focus of the personality can shift from constructive areas to a concentration of main energies in the area of impeding action or illness. In such a case, the illness actually represents a new unifying system. Now, if the old unifying system of the personality is broken down, the illness, serving as a makeshift temporary emergency measure, may hold the integrity of the personality intact until a new constructive unifying principle replaces the original. Unifying principles are groups of actions about which the personality forms itself at any given time. These usually change in a relatively smooth fashion when action is allowed to flow unimpeded. See how this ties in with Seth's advice to the students on the value of spontaneity and the difficulties of repression. These impediments, illnesses, may sometimes then preserve the integrity of the whole psychological system and point out the existence of inner psychic problems. Illness is a portion of the action of which personality is composed, and therefore it is purposeful and cannot be considered as an alien force that invades personality from without. Illness could not be called an impeding action unless it persisted long after its purpose was served. Even then, you could make no judgment without knowing all the facts, for the illness could still serve by giving the personality a sense of security, being kept on hand as an ever-present emergency device in case the new unifying system should fail. In other words, an action cannot be judged as impeding through a thorough knowledge of the actions that result in the makeup of any given personality. This is extremely important. To overlook this point is to risk the adoption of a more severe illness. When action is allowed to flow freely, then neurotic rejections will not occur. And it is neurotic rejections that causes unnecessary illness. All illness is almost always the result of another action that cannot be followed through. When the lines to the original action are released and the channels opened, the illness will vanish. However, the thwarted action may be one with disastrous consequences, which the illness may prevent. The personality has its own logic. Over and over again, Seth tells us that physical symptoms are communications from the inner self, indications that we are making mental errors of one kind or another. He compares the body in one session to a sculpture never really completed, the inner self trying out various techniques on its test piece. The results are not always of the best, but the sculptor is independent of his product and knows there will be others. He also has some fascinating comments on the relationship of various kinds of symptoms to the inner problems involved. Do not forget that you are a part of the inner self. It is not using you. You are the portion of it that experiences physical reality. Now, physical illnesses that are not critical but observable, that do not involve, say, loss of a limb or organ, generally represent problems that are in the process of being solved, problems that are out in the open. Such illnesses are the end product of a process of discovery. Inner problems are literally brought out where they can be faced, recognized, and conquered, using the symptoms as measuring points of progress. A trial and error system is involved, but the inner processes are reflected rather quickly by the physical condition. As Seth makes clear in other sessions, the symptoms in such cases are themselves part of the healing process. What we are supposed to do then is change our mental attitude, search ourselves for the inner problem represented by the symptoms, and measure our progress as the symptoms subside. In cases where the symptoms itself is interior, as in ulcers, there is a sign that the personality is not yet willing to face the problem, and the symptom itself is shielded from physical sight, quite rightly, symbolically speaking. The relative observability of a symptom is therefore a clue to the personality's attitude towards its problems. Many problems are never materialized. They remain as blank spots, uncultivated and unproductive areas within the psyche, areas in which there are no problems because no experience is permitted. There is then a mental, psychic, or emotional lack of sight and a complete blockage. Such a denial of experience is far more detrimental than a specific problem, for there is an inability on the part of the personality to express itself at all in that area. Rob's father has developing hardening of the arteries and is in a nursing home. He doesn't recognize any of us. When we visit him, We're surrounded by elderly people, more or less in the same condition. Accordingly, we were concerned about the problems of advanced age. According to Seth, each case of senility is different, but generally speaking, the personality transfers the vital parts of consciousness into the next area of existence and is often fully aware there and functioning. Gradually, the personality's mental focus leaves this life and begins to operate entirely on another level. The physical disease, the hardening of the arteries, is caused by the personality's gradual refusal to accept new physical stimuli, thus avoiding physical experience, either purposely or through error. People who are terrified of physical death might take this path, since when physical death occurs, consciousness is already acquainted with its new environment and the organism's death is relatively meaningless. In any case, the individual's inner decision causes the physical symptoms, not the other way around. You can even continue some symptoms after death. For example, Miss C, who lived in our apartment house, finally died of hardening of the arteries. One night I found myself out of my own body in a strange house, strange because while it was extremely old-fashioned, somehow it looked brand new. Miss C was just going out the door as I arrived. She was very distracted. Suddenly I knew that the house was a hallucination she had created, a replica of her childhood home, and I knew that she did not realize she was dead. At the same moment, I realized that my job was to explain the facts to her. I caught up with her, gently led her back into the house and said, "Miss C, you don't have to worry anymore about dying. It's already happened. Your mind can be perfectly clear now. It's all right." She seemed to understand, and as I finished speaking with her, another person came to take my place. I'd read about such instances, but I have to admit that I thought they were highly imaginative accounts until I found myself guiding Miss C. The point is that she was so frightened of death she didn't realize it was all over. Since her physical body was quite dead, she was in her astral body, yet she was acting confused and her mind was still unclear, as if she still had hardening of the arteries. According to Seth, during our reincarnational existences, we are to realize that we project our thoughts and emotions outward to form reality. When you realize, for example, that ill health is the projection of a distorted ideas outward onto the body, then you work to clear up the inner problems. This realization can cure even illnesses that are related to past lives. Since Seth says these existences are actually lived spontaneously, then these parallel selves exist in us now, and we can reach them through therapy. Remember our friend who kept falling in love with men she couldn't have. Finally, she grew more and more morose and attempted suicide several times. One night in her absence, we had a session for her, and Seth's advice here has important general implications. You have not accepted life on life's terms, he said. You are demanding that it behave in certain ways and take courses that you have consciously decided upon. You are refusing to accept life gladly as its own reason and cause within you. The idea that you must find a man that will love you is a cover to hide this deeper refusal to accept life on life's terms. You are saying, unless existence meets my terms, I will not exist, and no one has the right to set themselves against their own innate vitality. Once you wholeheartedly accept life on life's terms, then you may indeed get what you are after, but not while you insist upon it as a condition for continued existence. Your own purpose will make life a daily joy when you let your conditions go. You forget what you do have, health and vitality. You forget your intellect and intuitions. You forget what blessings are yours. You cannot pervert them by trying to force them to serve purposes that you have set up as a condition of existence. You must live in the faith that your purpose is and will be fulfilled, is being fulfilled. You must live in the faith that you have such a purpose and meaning, or you would not be here. The uniqueness that is your own personality is to be cherished. The particular purposes of your present personality can only be met in the present circumstances in the way that is best overall. The challenges can be met at another time and in another life, this is true, but the particular people that you can help now and the particular good that you can do now can never be done in precisely the same way. Men and women have joyfully honored the evening and the dawn and listened to the heart pulse within them with a blessing and a joy, who have not had 1/100th of your blessings or 1/3 the reason to look forward to another day. And they have fulfilled themselves and brought joy to others. They accepted life on its terms. And so, accepting, they were filled with a grace that comes from giving life all that you have. But exactly what is good health? In a recent class session, our dean asked Seth, "You should desire good health because it is a natural state of your being. You should trust in the innate intelligence of your own being. Health is its natural state. Through your physical image, the energy of the universe expresses itself. You, as an individual, as an individualized consciousness, are a part of this, and you cannot express yourself fully, nor fulfill your purpose as an identity if you are not in good health. For the effects of the body are felt in the mind, and the mind's effects are felt in the body." The dean wrinkled his brow. "You mean that I'm in good health, I'm spiritually in good shape? If you are in poor physical shape, this does not mean that you are an evil person. Let us clear that up. It means that you have a block in that particular area in which you are unable to utilize energy constructively. Theoretically, if you are using energy the way you should, you would be in excellent health and filled with abundance. Various kinds of lacks can show up in many ways, however. I do not want you to have the attitude that health or status, for example, is automatically or an indication of spiritual wealth. Some of you do well in certain areas and are blocked in others. The ideal is to use all your abilities, and in doing so that you will help others and the race of which you are part automatically. Seth suggests that self-hypnosis and light trance states be used as ways to uncover inner problems that are causing us difficulty. He also suggests that we simply ask the inner self to make the answer available on a conscious basis. If the inner problems are not discovered, we will simply exchange one set of symptoms for another. Various sessions include specific steps to be taken in these areas and others. Dreams are very important, both in uncovering problems and in providing solutions to them. In fact, the instructions are simple and can be used by anyone. So, you can think whatever you want about Seth. In this particular chapter, you see an example. It doesn't matter if Jane Roberts is writing this or Seth is. He's not proclaiming any supernatural causes. This is a masterwork in just basic psychology and an understanding that parts of our emotions and thoughts express themselves physically in our bodies, which is such an important thing to come to a realization of. You have emotions that get stuck in your bodies. You have anger that gets stuck in your liver, or anxiety that gets stuck in your kidneys. And people are very good at holding emotions inside of their body. Now, it's very interesting when you discuss the links between Seth and Abraham. Abraham was originally trained by Jane Roberts. She learned how to originally channel by reading Jane Roberts' book and used similar methods. And Abraham always refers to the inner self. And there's the same discussion in this book, the idea of the inner self, which I believe is the higher self. I think it's the same thing. There's a self within you. Perhaps it's your God self that Neville Goddard talks about. I think it is. In the Law of One, check out my episode on the higher self and the Law of One. It is a version of you that is 6.5 density in the future that has already lived this life and has gone back through the timeline and is here to assist you. That is running your subconscious. I don't know if it's linked into that same thing, but it is different than your ego. And we get a discussion of that in this chapter. And I appreciate that discussion. It is very, very powerful to simply start asking your inner self questions about what is this expression mean? What does this mean? Ask questions, whatever it is about your health, and you'll start to get answers. And I am a big believer in that. It's an important thing. I've also seen this idea that you meet people that cannot take responsibility for anything, and they always will blame their problems on something on the outside of themselves. It's all my mom's fault. It's all my mom's fault. It's all my mom's fault. And then they can't resolve the problem because the mom is the problem. And so one of the big things that you see from that first story of the woman that died was that she wasn't able to take any responsibility for anything in her life. She always tried to find the causes for her problems on the outside. And the idea that she hated herself. And so when you have these problems, they're reflected in your body and they can be reflected in your health. So check out my chapter, The Health Revolution. Check out my episode on The Health Revolution where I discuss this further. It is a fundamental part of reality creation. And my belief is once you're really in the flow and you're really working your energy and you're doing it well, it doesn't need to be a primary focus. Like, I need to be healthy. For some reason, there is sometimes the opposite effect that can occur from that. But genuinely do call up a healthy body, a healthy situation on a regular basis. Make that a part of the state that you assume. And for me, that has worked out. And it's still a learning process. The importance of this chapter is on eradicating those initial negative thoughts. And as Seth explains, that it is important for you to create a thought that is the opposite of that thought. So the question is, do you get these random thoughts of negative things? We all do. We are thousands of thoughts that we build through the day. But becoming very aware of those negative thoughts, and don't just let them pass through. Acknowledge them and remove them and imagine something the opposite. As you do this, you'll find that you have less negative thoughts. There's a part of your own subconscious or ego that will stop thinking these negative thoughts, because then you got to go through the process. You got to eradicate the thought. Sometimes I imagine it being spread out, the thought being spread out to all corners of the universe with no fluidity. And then I will imagine the opposite thought, or I will say out loud, this is not my thought or conscious intent. This thought is not my conscious intent. But there's some great suggestions in here to use, and some different phrases that you can use. And I really liked this particular explanation. It's very helpful. Seth does a very good job of describing it. Are you having health problems? And if you are, then let me imagine great health for you. Put your story in the comments, and I promise you, even if I don't comment, it is done. I will imagine. And if anybody else sees anything in the comments, then imagine good health for you. I have used my imagination so many times to help other people, and it's one of the funnest and best ways. If I can imagine that you'll come back and say good things about your health and the excitement that I feel. I've had people that I have imagined for that have overcome cancer, that have overcome blood diseases, that have overcome weight problems. And I want to imagine for you because I think it's very powerful. Now, you can imagine for yourself, and that is, of course, the most powerful. But hey, I'm always here to help. And if you want, I will imagine, and this whole community of people that are listening to this can also imagine for you. My biggest concern is that all the news, all the time, is talking about right now, if you're listening to this, I don't know when you're listening to it, but right now, is they're just talking about the coronavirus all the time. So every single time you talk in the news, you think it's important that you know this information, but they're talking about the symptoms, and they're talking about the disease, and they're talking about what people felt like and how people knew about the symptoms. And they're building a story so that everybody watching it is entering it into their subconscious minds, and they're going to experience sicknesses. I would love to know how many of the cases of people saying, I felt sick when this happened, were just a recreation from their subconscious of what they were hearing on the outside. There were all these stories of people that had sudden coughs or illnesses that they went through, and certainly many of those were caused by the coronavirus. But how many of those were caused by the placebo effect or the nocebo effect, where you began to feel these sicknesses? So it's very important what you're putting in your mind. If you need the information, maybe you can read it in the newspaper, or if you can time it out, give yourself 5 minutes of the news. You can get most of what you need in 5 minutes. And I promise you, most of the news right now is just going to be the same. It's going to be the same. And it's not helping you. So try to find positive news and try to remember positive states. If you would like a meditation for this, I have the Bliss Body meditation, which helps you to imagine your bliss body pulling in source. And I also have a sleep meditation, the Bliss Body Sleep Meditation. And the idea is to capture that state of health and really enter into it in the moment. And you'll see that state reproduced in your world, as Neville Goddard explains, as described by Dr. Joseph Murphy. And in this case, we have a description of it with Seth, but giving us important psychological techniques to maneuver through these things that naturally happen as we repress emotions and things like that. I wish I could just express to you how much I love all you guys and how much I enjoy sharing these metaphysical excursions. We'll definitely come back to Seth here in the near future. We have episodes for Dolores Cannon and Neville Goddard and Dr. Joseph Murphy and meditations and so much great stuff coming out. It's always a joy. All episodes of The Reality Revolution can be found at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.